Good evening, and thank you for joining us. My name is Ellis Dean, and I am the Senior Project Manager at blackdoctor.org. Tonight we're going to take a step away from our traditional COVID talks, and I know we've been talking about COVID a lot here lately, but tonight we're going to take a step away from that. We're going to talk about something else that it impacts our community, as well as something that impacts our Black community, really at a rate that's been much longer than COVID. COVID's been 2020, but this particular topic tonight is something that has been affecting us for a long, long time. And what I'm talking about is DWB, which is the acronym, of course, for Driving While Black. And so we all know, we all have had stories, whether personal experience or whether professional experience, about the kind of the inequities that happens with Black drivers versus majority or white drivers. And so tonight we're going to kind of explore some of those topics. We've got some really great panelists on with us tonight. It's amazing the panelists that we have tonight. And we're really going to, but now we're going to talk about the problem. We're going to identify the problem, talk about it. We're also going to talk about solutions, because I think that's most important when we're talking about problems of our community. We cannot just talk about the problems. We have to talk about solutions, specifically how do we overcome the phenomena of driving while Black. So I'm going to shut up because I'm the least accomplished panelist on tonight. So first off, I'm going to bring on former Judge Quentin G Washington. He's an Atlanta-based lawyer, political strategist, and crisis management expert. He's a graduate of Florida A&M University, the Harvard Kennedy School, and Emory School of Law. Recently recognized as one of the top 100 trial attorneys in the country, Quentin is one of the most sought-after attorneys and strategists for politicians and celebrities. Because of his trial advocacy skills, Quentin was selected to be a magistrate judge in Fulton County. There, he served for 3 years before stepping down to continue his private practice. He is a frequent commentator on Court TV and several other national networks, such as CNN. Welcome to tonight's discussion, Brother Washington.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for having me, Ellis.
Next up, we've got Chuck Hobbs. Chuck Hobbs is a former trial lawyer and current owner of the Hobbs Media Group, a graduate of Morehouse College, the Florida A&M University School of Graduate Studies, and the University of Florida College of Law. Hobbs, a two-time nominee for a Pulitzer Prize in commentary, analyzes political and social topics on his Hobbservation Point blog and podcast, Front and Center with Chuck Hobbs, and the Steel Sharpens Steel show, which I have had the pleasure of appearing on once ago. Welcome.
Good evening. Glad to be here with you, brothers.
It's so glad to have you. And finally, we have Dr. Eric Goodwin, who is not a stranger to blackdoctor.org. Dr. Goodwin is the CEO of Goodwin Wellness Enterprises, LLC, and Goodwin Medical Associates, LLC. He's a board-certified child, adolescent, and adult psychiatrist, as well as best-selling author, speaker, and integrative lifestyle coach. A graduate of Spelman College and the Emory University School of Medicine, she completed her general psychiatry training at Morehouse School of Medicine. She became a Gene Spurlock Congressional Fellow before training in child and adolescent psychiatry at Harvard. She is passionate about improving mental wellness, making people feel loved, cared for, and seen, and helping people see the best in themselves. Oh my goodness. Welcome. Goodwin.
Here.
Thanks for having me.
So I'm going to ask a question for everybody individually, and we'll start with you, Quentin. When you hear the term driving while Black, what first comes to your mind?
How real it is. Like, I've dealt with it in several capacities. The most alarming was when I was a judge in Fulton County, because the magistrate judges, we're the ones who sign out of warrants, which actually means I'm coming face to face on a nightly basis when I'm sitting with officers who I know are profiling people in Black communities, and they're getting warrants signed for people in Black communities. But the problem is that they actually find what they're profiling the people for many times when you sign in the warrants. And so it became a very real thing to me, because not only am I African-American, but I also have African-American children, right? So I don't want them to be victims of driving while Black. And, you know, the hope is that especially in a city like Atlanta, that's something that we can do something about.
Chuck, what do you think when you hear driving while Black?
When I think of driving while Black, like Brother Washington said, there are obviously issues that I've dealt with that we'll talk about tonight in my professional life, both when I was actively trying cases and both as a pundit, but it's personal to me on a very real level. The first time that I was profiled and pulled over, I was 17 years old here in Tallahassee, going to pick up one of my boys who lived over on Keith Street behind Bragg Stadium on FAMU's campus. It was a group of us together. Every last one of us wound up were scholars and went on to do great things in college and subsequent life. My friend that we were going to pick up was a Life Gets Better scholar before he died tragically at the age of 19 years old back in 1992. But the point being is that when those cops had us on that cold curbside that December evening, about 10:30, 11 o'clock at night, they didn't care that I was headed to Morehouse, Chris was headed to FAMU on Life Gets Better scholarship, Walter Smith's dad was the past president of FAMU, and that he was on his way to engineering degree at FAMU and doing great things, or that our friend Terry Calloway was ultimately going to march in the 100 and do great things either. They didn't care about that. They saw 4 young black men and they assumed that we were down there to buy and or sell drugs. And so I got initiated early. That's one instance, but I'm sure we'll talk about more before the night is over. But I knew full well then that no matter how articulate we were, no matter how high our grades were, no matter how high our SAT scores were, we were just Negroes that night that were an itchy trigger finger away from maybe being statistics. So I'm looking forward to having this discussion tonight.
Absolutely. And Dr. Goodwin.
Oh, hello. Well, I guess from my viewpoint is what it means to me is it means so many things because there's so many levels to driving while black. It's the personal experience that every black person has of their own concerns or fears that have happened because they've been stopped, but also extends to your family, your community, the concern that you may have for your children, your friends, your family when they leave the home and they're in a vehicle. So it's a way that just almost systemically that African Americans are traumatized or trauma exposed, and just that recurrent continual stress, even if you haven't really done anything wrong. Is I know myself, I always catch myself looking in my rearview mirror if I see a cop, even if I'm not speeding, I haven't done anything. But it's just that concern, and especially for all of you all out there on the panel and out there that have children, just the concerns of are your kids going to get stopped? Are your kids going to make it home?
Absolutely. So, just to kind of speak to some of those statistics, I was doing some quick research for this particular topic, and I found some interesting articles. One was done in North Carolina on traffic stops there in the North Carolina, South Carolina area. And some of the key takeaways, and this was done by a white professor at the University of South Carolina. And her 2 key takeaways was she said, basically, driving while black is very much a thing. And this is something that to dispel that myth from much of white America and law enforcement, they try to dispel those myths and say, oh, it's just something that's an urban legend and try to dismiss it as such. That she said it was very much a thing. And then she also said, which I found to be very interesting, she said it was much more systemic than a few bad apple officers engaged in racial profiling. So again, we've heard that bad apple theory being thrown out, especially here recently with all the social injustice and unrest around the country. The bad apple theory has always kind of been the big joker, so to speak, of law enforcement. And when you analyze the data, it's not really true. So some quick data, 63% black people were 63% more likely to be stopped, even though they drove 16% less. When road time is accounted for, blacks were about 95% more likely to be stopped there in the area. Blacks were 115% more likely to be searched in a traffic stop. Contraband was more likely to be found in searches of white drivers. So you have black drivers being searched more, but contraband being found more on white drivers. And black drivers were less likely to get a ticket, which she concluded that meant that black drivers were really being pulled over for something that wasn't a traffic violation, but they were just pulled over to conduct a search, to intimidate, to enforce the, hey, we're here, we're watching you, to make them feel that way. And then when they didn't find what they thought they could see or was looking for, they sent them on their way without a ticket. Finally, a couple of key takeaways she said was there was an erosion of trust, and I completely agree with that. For our community, for the Black community, we say, are you here to protect and serve? Are you here to intimidate and harass? And so those are key questions. And then also, female officers are less likely to conduct a search, but are more likely to find contraband when they do. So we're going to kind of talk about what that means in terms of who's pulling you over. And now we can go not only just from race, but we can go to race and gender. So, Chuck, I see you shaking your head. When I read all those statistics, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, right off top, and I know Brother Washington will hit on some of the same themes. What you realize is that when we start to segue into solutions tonight, it's a training thing, right? Like, again, at 17 years old, when I was pulled the first time, you're sitting there, you're frustrated, you're angry. More than anything, I was scared, just to be honest. Even though I was 6'1", 225 and strong as an ox, I still was a little bit nervous that because of that, and because everybody that was with me was similarly situated with the exception of Chris, the fear was, okay, this guy is kind of scared of us, interestingly enough. And then when the backup showed up, I realized too, okay, it doesn't matter how well we conjugate our verbs and syntax and sentence structure. They are nervous. They're thinking that they are going to have to go head up with us. And that was the farthest thing from our minds. But at the same point in time, I think that even now, flash forward 32 years later, the main issue comes down to a training issue. So when you have officers, be it a female officer or be it a male, that pull individuals over, particularly Black people, we want to stick with the racial aspect of it first. Many of them have these deep-seated racial biases that continue to remain problematic, that have to be dealt with from a training standpoint, both within the departments and even before then back at the academies. And because again, when I used to prosecute, right, and I used to work with a lot of police officers, obviously, to do the job, what I realized then is that there are a lot of police officers who really do not believe they're racist, particularly the ones that were born in the 70s, like each of us. And, they grew up going to integrated schools and like, hey, I used to like Run DMC too. And I love Public Enemy. I've got Chuck D on my wall back at home right now. I'm like, okay, that's great. But at the end of the day, there still is that concern, which is when it's them versus us, so to speak, and they're pulled, they're concerned. And I think it's an irrational concern. That's what I want to try to get at, which is the problem of, being able to communicate well. And what I have noticed in my career is that a lot of officers, they're taught they have to have that command authority type style of go, stop, pull, come, things of that nature. I get that. All right. My problem with it, though, is that it's not a one size fits all type of thing. I don't think that any of us would disagree that if an officer truly felt that they were at risk of or in danger and what have you, we would give them the benefit of the doubt. But the problem is that more often than not, that's not the case, especially nowadays that we have the dash cams and what have you. And you realize like, wow, this brother and this sister really did not escalate this thing to this point. They did. And so that's where some of the trouble comes in. And I'll yield the floor right now because it gets to my heart here.
Quentin, as an attorney, as a defense attorney, how do you, and as a Black man, how do you, I'm sure you've had clients that said, I was being profiled, or he was picking on me, whatever, for lack of a better term. How do you remain objective when you come to this situation, when you're trying to defend a client, when you're trying to depose an officer in a case? How do you remain objective, but still know that statistically speaking, this might have been a profiled stop?
You have to look at the evidence ultimately. But the problem is when you're looking at the evidence is, what do you do when in certain communities they have cameras which allow you to run tags and all this type of stuff? So like officers are literally sitting in a location where they're looking and like, get that car, get that car, get that car, get that car, etc. Right? They go and pull these cars over for a suspended license, for tail, for registration expired, for tag light out, etc. They pull these cars over in certain communities, and when they pull them over, they smell marijuana in the car. They see alcohol or they smell alcohol in the car. The person they ask for their license, which they have the ability to do, and all of a sudden they recognize this person has a warrant out for them. Like, that's the problem, is that we can't get to an academic discussion about driving while black until we get past the truth that many times happens when these officers pull people over. If they pull you over because they suspect you got drugs in the car because you black and you in a Dodge Charger or a Dodge Shelby or a Challenger, etc., and you got drugs in the car, right? You can say I got profile, you have drugs in the car too.
Right.
I mean, you just like, so at that point, but you have to understand this, and this is very important. The way the system is set up, right? The way the system is set up, when I'm sitting on the bench, I can't tease out whether or not that's a profile, because remember, the only person, here's what people have to understand. Here's the way warrants work. If a police officer thinks something has happened, what they do is they get on the telephone and they call me. At that point, I get on my state or county issued computer and we go into a hearing. I swear them in, just like I'm sitting here now. They're sitting on the other side of the screen. They're the only people talking to me about what happened, right? So what are they going to tell me? They're going to say, I pulled this person over because they had a tail light, a suspended license, et cetera, et cetera. And then what flowed from that was I found drugs, I found a probation warrant, I found et cetera, et cetera. I have probable cause for a warrant, right? That's the only thing I hear. Whoever is in the car, they're not going to appear in front of the camera. They're going to appear in front of another judge at first appearance after they've been arrested, right? So that's where the driving while black is tough to tease out in an academic sense, because the reality of what happens, I have to deal with before I get to the academic. Are these people being profiled because they're black?
Absolutely. So Dr. Goodwin, I know even now, and I haven't had a traffic ticket in several years now, thank the Lord. But I know when I was in the system, and Quentin spoke to this briefly, and we're going to talk about that. When you get in that system, if you don't clear yourself out, if you don't have the resources or the wherewithal to get out of that system, it can bring you in. It's like quicksand. It can continue because you've been popped. And so the likelihood that you have some contraband or you're doing something again that might be outside of the confines of the law, they're going to pop you again. And now you get caught in the system. Or if you don't complete all the requirements that come with it, if you don't have the money to pay for the tickets and the court fees and fines, this thing can get really, really out of hand. And so that anxiety that comes into play every time, and, everybody, and it's kind of a running joke amongst the Black community, but every time when the police come by or get behind us, you talked about it earlier, you get that little surge of anxiety. What does that do to the body? What does that do to the mental state of Black drivers?
Well, the hard thing is, number one, is when you look at everything from a mental health perspective, it tends to be more like a continuum. So a lot of times people will talk about when people have mental illness, and they'll mean when people actually meet criteria for something that's a major mental health diagnosis. But what you end up seeing with a lot of these situations is there are people that'll tip the scales and have diagnosable mental health issues. But there's this level of stress and almost trauma that's happening to people that doesn't necessarily reach the level of having a traditional diagnosis, but it definitely is stressful. So you're going to see people with responses that increase their cortisol. You'll see, naturally anybody out there, I'm sure, that is Black that has been behind the wheel of a car. When you start having those experiences, your heart starts beating fast, you may start breathing a little different, just feel totally on edge, is that physiologically can affect you. So some people, it's that cumulative stress tips them over into another mental health issue, or to really starting to actually have symptoms more than just that couple of minutes where you may see a police officer or be being pulled over. And then people that are actually pulled over, depending on how you were treated, they changed the criteria for like PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, a few years ago when they made DSM-5, stands for Diagnostic Statistical Manual, the 5th edition, even though they're more than that because they did TRs and Rs and all this stuff. And shifted it because a while ago, the criteria was more like you had to experience something and it had to be just super bad. But now it's a lot of this indirect trauma, but also even the anticipation that something bad is going to happen. So what ends up happening is people are having these lower level trauma responses. And then there are times where someone actually gets stopped. It's a situation like Chuck, and I'm sure most of you have experienced, because especially almost all the Black men I know have been not just pulled over, but have been pulled out of the vehicle. I was lucky. When the last time I was pulled over for driving while Black, they said I was driving too cautiously. But didn't actually make me get out of the car. And all of you that know me, I don't even drink alcohol. So this is all extremely comedic. It's comedic and tragic. But it just makes people have trauma responses, which can then affect how they interact with people. I'm going to wrap up because I feel like I'm talking a lot, but it shifts the lens people are looking through. So naturally, the more afraid you are, you're going to respond as if you are afraid. And fear, it usually comes out with either it's going to look like anxiety or it'll look like irritability or agitation. So it's no mystery that someone can pull someone over. They were pulled over for driving while Black, and then they sound angry, mad, or frustrated, a la the tape of Sandra Bland, because they're like, why'd you pull me over? But the problem is being Black, if you were white and you're like, why you pull me over, it turns into a conversation. When you're Black, the conversation of why'd you pull me over? And if you're frustrated while you ask him why they pulled you over, can lead to much dire consequences. And I think the fact is everyone, the stakes are much higher, because even, if you take out the group of people that Quentin talked about, that something kind of shady was going on in the vehicle, but then there are people that nothing was going on, that you can have a really bad consequence and not have been doing anything. And I think that's that spot that causes such a level of fear. Chuck and them weren't doing anything. They just driving.
We were late, and we were late to the party. I mean, that was the other part. We're sitting there thinking, dude, like, we're not in college yet. Yeah, we're about to mess around and miss the party and have to be back home on this curfew at 11:30, 12 midnight and what have you. Like, come on, officer, write the ticket so we can go ahead and jet. That's kind of also in the back of our 16, 17-year-old minds too.
I think, and Chuck, that brings, Erica speaks to a good point. Officer walks up to the car, officer gets behind you, anxiety level goes up. Your heart starts beating faster. You might start sweating because of that.
Absolutely.
Officer walks up to the car, he's making an assessment of how you look.
Yeah.
And that is anxiety from him getting behind you, but he might see it as, oh, is he on some sort of drug? Is he drinking? Is there something else? Or is he nervous about having contraband in the car? The officer reads anxiety as something completely different. And now it goes even further. And now you're becoming more agitated because you weren't doing anything wrong to have him get behind you in the first place. And now he's reading you differently. And so therefore it gets further and further down the line.
Ellis, that's a perfect comment and segue, and it ties into what both Erica and Quentin have been saying here in regards to what I'm going to call my example two. Example two was about maybe the year 2006, 2007. I had a hearing on a criminal case down in Orange County, Orlando, Florida. I took off from Tallahassee. I had court in Tallahassee that morning at 8:30. I got on the road around 9:15. You all went to FAMU. Erica, I'm sure you've been through Florida. It's usually about 3.5 hours to get to Orlando, 4 hours if you're driving like what Erica says, real cautiously and what have you. But I'm not going to lie. I was jetting down 75. I got past Ocala, was headed to that turnpike, and I got pulled. And so I immediately knew, okay, he's got me. Like, no question, not trying to like be a jerk or anything like that. I had just got a new car, not trying to humble brag or nothing, but I just got the new Mercedes E-Class. It was fresh to death. But I had my coat in the car, like in the back, like a lot of professional men and women do. It was hanging up clearly. I had on a shirt and tie. I'm in a brand new Mercedes, right? You're thinking to yourself, University of Florida law, circle plates. I'm thinking to myself, okay, yeah, I'll probably take about 15, 20 minutes off of the time when I need to get to Orlando because this officer's going to write the ticket. Yes, you were speeding. You were doing about 85, close to 90 and a 70. So yeah, I'm like, I'm guilty. I'll pay for the ticket, do what I got to do. Officer pulls up, starts walking. Put your hands where I can see them now. He's screaming, put your hand. And I'm sitting there thinking to myself, like, what is it about me, dressed as well as I am, driving what I'm driving, even though he hasn't had a chance to talk to me yet. But in my brain, I'm like, shouldn't something register with him, even if you're looking at the little tag that surrounds my Florida license plate that says University of Florida College of Law? Shouldn't that make you think, hey, de-escalate? Sure, the guy is speeding. I'm going to write a speeding ticket. But why screaming? Why with your hand on the weapon while you're approaching as if I'm going to do something dumb like that? And so that segues into what Quentin and Erica were talking about, which is, again, Quentin, you had me laughing when you were talking about, yeah, if you've got weed in the car, if you've got cocaine and, you know, scales in the trunk and what have you, you know, don't come in my courtroom talking about, hey, man, brother judge, you know, show me some love here because, you know, we brothers got to stick together. No, if you're doing wrong, you're doing wrong. But what I am concerned about is that one size fits all type of policing that we're seeing, whereby there is no delineation made in those quick moments in terms of, okay, is this a legitimate threat that I pulled over, or is this just a guy that's speeding for some reason? And maybe I need to ascertain maybe something's going on. Maybe he's having a medical emergency. Who knows why he's speeding? Not coming to the car, hand on weapon, screaming to the top of your lungs where I can hear you clearly as the semi-trailers pass me on I-75.
See, and I guess here's the way I think about it. When I think about officers who I know work really hard, you know, it's much like teachers, except officers make, when they top out on the pay scale of what they're being paid, they make less than teachers, right? Officers typically, you're talking Georgia State Patrol making maxing around 55, 60, where the officers make their money $55,000 to $60,000 a year, and you've been working on the force 10, 15 years, right? The way most officers make their money is by doing private gigs on the side, right? And so the question then becomes, how much discernment and how much training do you have when it's arguable that the best and the brightest may not stay in that position because I'm not saying, let me make very clear, I'm not saying police officers are dumb and lower intelligence or anything like that, but the economic realities of that, because if I make $50,000 a year and I'm working 40 hours a week, and then I got to go pull another 20 to 30 hours a week to make money to help support my family to get me, you know, to what closer to the lifestyle I want to lead. It just puts a lot of pressure on them, but also it takes away a lot of discernment that they may have because of, you know, we talking about mental health issues. Well, they got them as well because they're not sleeping. They're in high stress situations all the time. They obviously don't know what's in the car, right? And so because of that, and so you can look at different models, whether it's community policing, I think that would help. But if Chuck is coming out 75 and he's got Tallahassee, Leon County tags, the community's not gonna know who he is, right? So you got all those different variables that come into play with somebody who's, you know, doing a whole bunch of work in a whole bunch of high dangerous, high stress capacities. And it's just tough all the way around to then say, all right, well, you got to do a whole bunch of training, and you can be trained, but what happens when you don't know what's about to happen and you want to go home at night or in the morning or when your shift ends like everybody else does?
Dr. Goodwin, let's talk about shift just a little bit, and we're going to get back to, and we're going to start moving to talking about solutions. But let's talk about the exception rule, right? And so what I mean by that is when we get from birth throughout our lives, we get bombarded with images, and some of those images are positive and negative. And we all know about the negative imagery associated with Black people in general, and then Black men specifically. And so when you get bombarded with that imagery, whether it's in your conscious mind, it is definitely in your unconscious mind with regards to the normal state, right? So that's the attribution of what this particular group of people typically does or typically is. And so when we see people, so even what in Chuck's example, what he was like, he saw a Black man. All those other cues didn't register. He saw a big Black man driving this car, and the attribution he made was he might be a drug dealer. The reason why he has his Mercedes, not the fact that he is an attorney that has on 3 degrees and is going to court down in Orlando. And so those images, that image kind of shapes his, and so the exception is when he found out who Chuck was, that's that was an exception. I made a mistake in that case, but more often than not, I'm right. And so how do we overcome that exception rule where we have, and the same thing is happening to police officers. So that's what Quentin is talking about. The same thing has happened to police officers. We see what happened to George Floyd. We see what happened to Sandra Bland. We see what happened to Philando Castile. But to Quentin's point, more often than not, police officers going to work every day, doing their job, going home, taking care of their family. But when we see George Floyd, we go, that's how they all are. And so we're attributing all those negative characteristics to the entire profession. So how do we overcome that psychologically so we don't just apply that exception rule in negative ways?
You make it sound like there's one simple solution.
Look, you double board certified. You're supposed to have all the answers. That's why we're here.
I'm like, I'd be like super rich if I could figure out the simple solution. Because part of it goes back to what we've been alluding to, which is systemic racism and bias. Mm-hmm. Is that it's going to take a lot of education and retraining of social norms for people then to shift out of those biases, because you could actually, in some of these cases, substitute bias for what we would call in mental health cognitive distortions. That's just a fancy way of saying that you have a very specific perspective or way you look at things that may not be totally based in reality. Mm-hmm. It might be your reality in your mind, but it's not really what's going on. And what ends up happening for a lot of people, and I think what's going to need to happen for this change is, number one, is a large amount of people are going to have to be open to re-examining how they look at the world and look at the people that occupy space in this world with them. Because the first thing is, people have no desire to change. They're not going to change. They're going to hold on to whatever beliefs they have. So it's also being open to reality testing to see that that may not be the case all the time. And I think that openness is what ends up having that space, so that, number one, people will get to know people outside of their personal circle, because there are people we all run into, because, everyone here happens to be Black on this panel. And as especially Black professionals with multiple degrees, we've had to learn how to navigate through a lot of different areas, different socioeconomic statuses. All of us have at one point lived in the hood, worked in the hood. We may or may not have grown up in the hood. Most of us don't live in the hood anymore. But at some point we had to navigate through kind of everything. White people, Black people, not Black, you name it, we had to navigate through it. And the universal experience for everyone is not that experience of having to navigate through so many spaces that naturally have some sense of equity and understanding.
But see, let me piggyback there, Erica, on this, because what I think is also important is that what we don't understand is the cultural context of which we're having these conversations, right? Understand, we on the panel, we're the first generation to go to integrated schools. Understand the importance of that, right? So the bias that they have is because they don't know us, right? Because they hadn't had to know us, because their parents didn't know us, right? So when we went to school, especially the folks on this panel, we went to school in an era of respectability politics, right? Mm-hmm. You go to school, you get your lesson, don't get in trouble, keep your mouth shut. There are going to be some subtle indignities that you face, but that's just par for the course, because guess what? You're not integrating schools for yourself, you're integrating it for society. Because where I'm from in Warner Robins, schools integrated in the late 60s, early 70s. Right. So understand that as we're talking about this, we're talking about a bias because there has not been the interconnectedness of the communities, because there hadn't had to be the interconnectedness of the community. So that's happened in our lifetime. And you see that everything is now segregating again. Right? Because you see now that the public schools, especially in all your major cities, all the public schools are predominantly minority, right? And so all the schools in the suburbs aren't. And so as they begin to get integrated, then you have the private schools, which are now predominantly non-Black, non-Latino, non-et cetera. And so the problem is that as a society, until we actually place as a value the melting pot, which means that there's an acceptance of my difference as an African American, just as we have to accept that there's some differences in the white community, the Latino community, et cetera, that we all accept. Until we do that, there's going to always be these biases because you don't know me. You just know of me because of what you see on TV and social media and what your parents said. But remember, what your parents said was inherently biased because they didn't know our parents, because they didn't interact together.
Right.
So we got to understand the cultural context under which we're having these conversations, because that's what people don't understand. Because in the greater scheme of things, Brown v. Board was 50, 60 years ago. Right? So there are people still living, i.e. our parents, who know and remember that. They remember Ruby Lee Bridges. Like these are things they remember because these people are still alive now.
Yeah. Quentin, right on point. It's funny. I was having a discussion centered upon what you just said the other day. As much as I have always loved history, and as much as I write about it and talk about it now, as important as Brown versus Board of Education was, as important as the civil rights movement was, just like Quentin said here, when you think about those of us that were born in the late 60s or early 70s, like those of us on the panel here, when we started kindergarten, these school systems were only a few short years removed from segregation. And I think that gets lost in translation sometimes when, if you really stop and think back on some of the subtle indignities that you might have dealt with in your elementary school, middle school, and high school, you're talking about having teachers, by and large, many of us who started their careers, and principals who started their careers in segregation. All right. And I'm talking about white teachers, some, not all, but some who never thought when they started working in 1962, 63, or even before, that they would have to teach little black kids. And so do the racists just all of a sudden stop being racist, or does bias, even if you don't want to go to the level of saying someone is a racist, do those racial biases just magically morph away just because in Warner Robins in the early 70s or in Leon County in the early 1970s, now all of a sudden black kids and white kids can go to school together? And so I think that is also an area that I want to delve into more in the days and months ahead in regards to when we're talking about documentaries, when we're talking about writing. It is so important that our stories get told because, again, there's a large body of scholarship about our parents' generation, and I love talking to them. My mother's still alive. My dad died 20 years ago, but it's still a benefit to be able to hear that generation. But we've got stories to tell too. And one of the things I just want to add on that, which we're talking about here, is they don't know us, that Quentin is saying, that Erica is saying. It's so true because even when we were in integrated environments in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, they weren't integrated. They were still by and large segregated. And that's not to say that I don't have some white friends that I consider to be lifelong good friends. I do. But for the most part, blacks hung with blacks, whites hung with whites. Even when you played sports, when you were on the football team or the basketball team or the baseball team, yeah, you might have lined up together, but you really didn't kick it with them like that. When the game was over, you went and hung out over here on south side of town. They went and hung out wherever they hung out. And heck, sometimes I don't even know where they hung out. That's how segregated it was, even within the integrated society, so to speak, because I was with us. And so with that in mind, Quentin's dead spot on in regards to they don't know us because they've never really had to, but we've always had to know them. And as we start to talk about the solutions, I think I'll just go ahead and say it straight out. One of the things I tell my nephews and will tell my daughter when she becomes of age, and will continue to tell anybody that I mentor, which is the goal is to get home. Just like Quentin said, the officers want to get home. Your goal is to get home too. So one of the things that I do is in my cars, I keep my license and my registration and information over my head on the visor. So what happens is if I happen to be pulled, the officers will never see me fidgeting. They'll never be like, oh, he made some furtive moves toward, and I thought he was reaching for a gun. Can't hold no gun up there in the visor. So if I get blazed because they thought it was furtive moves, y'all go ahead and y'all take it to the door. No justice, no peace. Be like, we know good and well, Chuck Hobbs, didn't have no gun up there on the visor. That dude just wanted to shoot. So little things like that. Also keeping your voice as calm as you can. And I know that's tough, as Erica can talk about, but you have to try to de-escalate. And I do want to add that last piece on my example too. I didn't even get a ticket that day. Once the officer calmed down, because I de-escalated. I didn't start screaming. I didn't start yelling. I didn't start with the, I'm a lawyer, you can't talk to me like that. What I did is when I handed him my driver's license, I handed him my Florida bar card as well. And then once he looked at it, he was like, well, where are you heading, counselor? I said, hey, I need to be in Orlando in about an hour and I'm running late now for real. And he said, okay, just slow it down some. But again, if I had been a jackass about it, and I had a right to be a jackass about it, don't get me wrong, I could have been as nasty as I wanted to be, but common sense said, get home. It's not like my father used to say, and y'all knew my dad from your time on the yard. Dad used to say it was a whole lot of N-words that are right, who were right. And they'll put on the tombstone, here lies Chuck Hobbs, he was right, but you're not here, you're gone. So we have to keep that in mind.
I think y'all both are bringing up a very interesting point in terms of they don't know us, because I was, I learned how to, code switching is a term that we know in our community. And for those that are watching that don't know what code switching is being able to speak the language of your friends and your family and your kin and your cousins, and then being able to switch that language to talk to whites and others, or in a more, in a professional setting. And so that
your formal language,
right? So my family moved into, we were the only Black family in a white neighborhood growing up. And, that's how I learned how to code switch and went to the white school. But to that exceptionality, when I was tested and made it into gifted, it wasn't that I was representative of what Black students could do as a collective. I was the exception. And so therefore I was pulled out of classes and the community, and and that was the talk that I would get. Oh, you're different. You're not like other Black people. Other Black people aren't as smart as you, blah, blah, blah. You're an exception. And so that part of it can seep into your consciousness, which it didn't, because it was like, this is because all the Black people that I did know in Jack and Jill and in my family were all exceptions. And so I'm like, you can't have that many exceptions. That is a rule that they just don't understand. And when you're talking about they don't know us, that is a key piece. And so I wrote a piece years ago after I went to my 20th high school reunion, and I was writing before then, and they asked me to be the speaker at our 20th reunion. And I was like, y'all asking me to be the speaker? And it was interesting, the dichotomy that we have as a Black experience in a white environment. So here I was a superlative voted. I'm in the yearbook. I was most humorous. I was winning scholarships all over the place. I was in advanced courses and blah, blah, blah. But I never went to prom. Didn't have a girlfriend in high school. I suffered the microaggressions every single day, even though I was celebrated because I was a high achieving Black student. I didn't have the full high school experience that other students had because of my Black skin. And so therefore, and because of that divide. And so therefore, when you say they don't know, it's right. I was there in the middle of them, in classrooms with them, next to neck, elbow to elbow. And even after I wrote that piece 20 years later, I had high school classmates said, I never knew you were going through that.
Wow.
And my response to them is that you never cared enough to ask. And so therefore, when you talk about knowing us, when you talk about that dichotomy, that this group of professionals in terms of the 70s babies, we really do have a unique story to tell, because you're right. My mother would always tell me, and I didn't understand it until I got older. She would say, be friendly, but not familiar. And so y'all understand, y'all know immediately what she said. She grew up in segregation. She knows what it's like. She can speak to that, and that's not out, and that's her formative years impressed upon her. So even though I was in this integrated environment and they were celebrating me, she was like, don't trust it. And she said, you know where your roots are, understand you. And she supplemented my education because they weren't doing it in the classroom. So that being said, Erica, when you're hearing all this going on, what is your professional mind saying?
Well,
this is Black Doctor.
Yes, we talked about how they didn't know us when we were younger, but to me, it's still further demonstrated by the fact that ourselves and our peers are experiencing still a lot of firsts that you think, why are we still having firsts in 2020, 2019, in the 2000s? Or
Just wrote about that today, matter of fact.
Being first or being onlys.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And that's one of the beautiful and crazy things about Facebook is that you'll find out someone, you'll be in a group and it'll be like the first head of such and such. And you're like,
now?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's been around 60 years, and I think it just says that narrative it's a huge, long, lengthy narrative, but it's everything has so many pieces because there's this issue of they don't know us. Then there's the issue you were talking about that people didn't ask you what you were going through. But I even had an experience when I was in fellowship and was the only Black physician in my entire department, where I had dinner with another fellow. This is probably about at least 10, 15 years later. And she didn't know what I went through, but also it wasn't I never felt like any place was a safe space to tell anybody what I was actually experiencing.
Exactly.
So I feel like the solution in the space we're in a unique time that it seems like out of all of the 40-something years I've been alive, that it seems like people are at least becoming more open to having these discussions and re-examining issues of race and equity in a way that I don't feel like it's been part of a conversation previously. Is that my hope in the space I see is that as we're able to create more safe spaces, that people will be able to have the conversations necessary to start getting the education and the understanding of what equity and even on the lowest level tolerance even is.
Well, here's the thing, right? And I have to say this because I'm here in Georgia, because I'm gonna dovetail it like this, Chuck, and you're gonna appreciate this. The superintendent for Houston County Schools that integrated them was a gentleman named David Perdue. David Perdue is a senior now because his daddy, senior, is no longer with us. Okay. Because remember, I'm from Houston County.
Right.
So that's Sonny Perdue, that's David Perdue, that's David Perdue, the other David Perdue, who is the U.S. Senator, right? Mm-hmm. So in putting that in context, I couldn't have imagined us talking about in other company, white supremacy, institutional racism must be dismantled, the patriarchy, like all those terms. Like if we were talking about those terms, it was understood that we were way out on the fringe element. Mm-hmm. And so, we remember when Dr. King didn't have a holiday, mm-hmm. right? And so now everybody reveres, but also, washes him in goodness that they wouldn't do today if he said what he said, right? And so I guess I say that because in thinking about it, when I'm looking at all these ads that are running in Georgia, when people are talking about the police and law and order and Raphael Warnock being, bringing in socialism because he wants to defund the police and all that type of stuff. Let's be clear about something. Black people do not want to defund the police. Right. Black people don't want to be shot by the police.
Thank you.
Those are two separate and distinct things.
Thank you.
Right? When I call the police, I want them to show up.
Right.
But I don't want them to show up and use lethal force where it's not necessary.
Right.
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 So when people are talking about, but for whatever reason, because they don't know us, this argument can take legs of its own, because there are a lot of political, pundits and pollsters who said that the defund the police might have been the reason why we didn't take the Senate. Because there was the understanding that, maybe it was the Democratic Party that's going to usher in an era of lawlessness. Mm-hmm. That's never been the case. If I didn't want law and order, I wouldn't be, Chuck wouldn't be a lawyer. I wouldn't be a lawyer. I wouldn't have definitely been a judge if I didn't believe in the system, right? But we all understand that there's an imperfect system that we're trying to deal with. And the only way you can deal with the system is you got to have inputs on the inside and you got to have inputs on the outside to change the system. Yeah. So yes, in a city like Atlanta, yes, there's driving while black, but here's where the issue comes in. You got driving while black, but you got black officers pulling over black people driving while black.
Right. Quentin, you hit it right on the head, because like this summer, not long after Rayshard Brooks was killed and all the tumult was in Atlanta, if you all recollect, I don't remember these two kids' names, but the Morehouse and the Spelman student, the boyfriend and girlfriend.
That was terrible.
Yeah, they snatched out the car like rag dolls and tased. And those were black officers for the most part. There was, I think, one or two white officers there, but for the bulk of it, those were brothers that were beating them down and tasing them. And so we have to talk about that too. We have to recognize that for some officers, again, not all, and I hate to have to do this, but I do try to preface my discussions with the police that we're not talking about all police. I mean, I say that with air quotes because at the end of the day, I'm a big personal believer that if somebody is saying something negative, like for instance, all Kappas suck, I'm sitting around like, well, you ain't talking about me because I don't suck. So it's like, you have to let certain things go right over your head and what have you. But since some people are touchy-feely, I have to always throw out there, we're not talking about all police. There are plenty of wonderful men and women who are out here putting it on the line every day, and we appreciate that. And Quentin hit it right on the head. I know that I don't want to defund, but I also want to be treated the same as anybody else. I mean, that's really, at the end of the day, what it is. I remember there was a time in my life where there was a disturbance, heard something outside, and went to go and check to make sure everything was all right. And I had my weapon on me. And then it occurred to me that with the 911 call, I was like, well, you better put your weapon up and go back inside because it's 2 a.m. and you're now 6'1", 300 something pounds. And if you've got a weapon, you might get shot out there in your yard, if you get where I'm coming from. So I don't think many of my white colleagues and friends have to worry about that. If they see or hear a disturbance and they've got their weapons on them, they're big Second Amendment folks themselves and what have you, they're not going to go and be like, well, let me hurry up and put the weapon up because I don't want to get shot by an officer when they come to investigate. So those are some of the little indignities that I think we have to work on, but we have to keep agitating for it. It's not just going to happen overnight. Intelligent people like we are have to go ahead and make the petitions. And again, I agree, Quentin, in terms of I did not see this happening when we were younger, the ability to be able to be this forthright. We had it on the campus of Florida A&M University. We had it at Morehouse. We had it at Spelman. At every HBCU, people were able to talk freely about any and everything under the sun. But you're right. When I got to the University of Florida College of Law, many of us were way more circumspect, like our parents taught, when we were not in, when we were in mixed society. Let's just put it that way. We didn't talk as raw. And now this is different. On social media, I come raw, Erica's raw, Quentin, you're raw, Ellis, you're raw. You say what you got to say. And I think it's helping. I think that, you're going to have some people who are going to troll and going to have negative things to say. But for the most part, there are people who are different than we are, who are actually listening, and they are learning from the stories that we're telling and our experiences. And that's what we have to hope, because they need to have those conversations in their houses with their children and at their churches in regards to how to stop systemic racism. We can't stop it. We can't pray it away. We can't kneel it away. Y'all have to stop it because it's on y'all. Y'all are the ones that are killing us. And I'm saying y'all in the collective for anybody who's listening and saying not me. I get it, not you. But collectively, that's what we're worried about.
Well, we're talking about percentages. And so, there was a study in Stanford. They studied 100 million traffic stops from 2011 to 2017 across 21 state patrol agencies, including California, Illinois, New York, Texas, and 29 municipal police departments, including New Orleans, Philly, San Francisco, and St. Paul, Minnesota. And much like the North Carolina and South Carolina study, Black and brown people were stopped and searched more often and on the basis of less evidence than used with white drivers. White drivers were searched less, but again, more likely to be found with illegal items. So again, we're talking about choices, and you have to make a decision as an officer. There's a bunch of cars. There's 20 million traffic stops that happen in a year, every year, 20 million traffic stops. Officers have to make a decision who to stop, who not to stop. And it seems more often than not, they are choosing to stop Black and brown people. And there was, to give it the full context, they did talk to some police officers, the Fraternal Order of Police, and they said, well, basically, those communities are high crime communities, and so therefore they have more officers there. So therefore, subsequently, there's more stops. Was his explanation for that. But when they did the study and they're looking at the statistics, they said night did not play a significant role in the stop. So you could say, well, it was nighttime, so they didn't know the ethnicity of the driver. Night didn't play a significant role. It was the same during the daytime. And then of the contraband searches, 36% contraband on the white drivers, 32% black, 26% Latino. And so therefore, again, that supports the assertion that even though white drivers are pulled over less, they're still finding more contraband on white drivers. And so therefore, the assumption of innocence. So what you're talking about, Chuck, is big black man standing there with a gun. You're just protecting your home, but he's going to see you because the images and everything he's been taught in his life, he's going to see you as a threat. Versus if he saw a same-sized white man, he's going to perceive him less as a threat. He might ask him to put the weapon down or shoot the weapon, but he's not going to come out guns blazing in that space because he's going to feel safer with a white person there versus a black person. And so I do want to shift the conversation a little bit to solutions as we're moving forward, because we could talk about problems all night long.
Sure.
So there was a good question in the chat room from Bernadette. I'm going to put this on the screen. Why is it for African Americans to solve why a pocket of police cannot interact positively with African Americans? And so I think what Bernadette is getting at is, why are we solving their problem?
Because they don't think it's a problem. So the people that are being harmed by it have to say something, because if we don't, there's going to be no movement.
Absolutely. Erica, why are we solving their problem? If it's the police's problem, if it's the majority community's problem that they see Black people, when they see a Black person, they think criminal immediately. Why are we solving that problem for them?
The simple, quick answer is we don't want to die. Because they're killing us. And it's not everyone. I feel like we all have to give our disclaimers. I actually have a cousin that went into being a police officer after Michael Brown. That is doing really good work. But it's, number one, we don't want to die. Number two, we don't want to just be locked up either, because that's the other issue. We talk about a lot about when people are either have a significant amount of mortality, which means they die, or morbidity, which means they are totally jacked up. Because, we talk about people that get shot or things like that, and then they're paralyzed or they're just really jacked. But it's that a lot of people, quite frankly, there are more of us at times that may have some limited resources. And I know Chuck and Quentin could talk at length about this. Is the other issue is if you get pulled over and you get arrested, if you don't have the right resources, you will be just sitting in jail, waiting to be charged, waiting on your hearing. You may have your hearing and not be able to post bail, so then you're still there. You can just be in jail for the most ticky-tack small thing for huge amounts of time, which you get the trauma of being incarcerated. It leads to issues in your family and your community. You can lose your job and then not have a way to support yourself and your family. There are just a lot of ways these things trickle down. So we have an investment in the change. And if it doesn't change, the people that are doing it to us, they're going to be good if it doesn't change, but we won't.
Yep.
Yeah.
So Chuck, is it incumbent upon those of us that reside in the if you ascribe to the talented 10th theory, is it up to us in the talented 10th to say the reason why we have to stand up for the rest of the community and culture and say, here's what's going on and here's why it needs to stop?
Yeah, it shouldn't be, but it is. And so we have to take that baton and we have to run with it. And we run with it in multiple fashion. Number one, self-policing. And by self-policing, I mean the discipline, as we all have talked about here tonight, to understand that you de-escalate. If you're pulled over, yes, you're nervous. Yes, we know that your palms are sweating. You might be perspiring. Your heart's racing out your chest, but you have to stay calm because the key is you want to get home. And so if you start yelling, you start cursing, you start moving too quickly, those could very well be your last move. So we have to make sure that we discipline ourselves and that we teach and discuss that within our homes and within our fraternities, sororities, and schools, and definitely on social media, because a lot of people like to besmirch social media, but there's a lot of good that comes out of social media as well, in my experience. That's number one. The number two, it's the age old, you have to know who your local elected officials are. We love talking about the presidential races. We love talking about the runoffs up in Georgia, with Warnock and Loeffler and Ossoff and Perdue. I mean, that's going to get the majority of the ink. But on a day-to-day basis, for not only those of us on this panel, but people who are watching, your local elected officials are far more important to what goes on with you than who is going to be in the White House for the next 4 years. And it always kind of trips me out during each election cycle every 2 to 4 years when I start to get calls, and I'm not saying this in a condescending way, but there are people who are on election day or during early voting who are calling me up or texting me and like, who is this person running for state attorney or district attorney, or who is this person that's running? And I'm like, y'all, you really need to know who your district attorney is, who your state attorney is, who your sheriff is. Those races are important because those are the people who your mayor is, because when it hits the fan, if you or a loved one happen to be beaten or harassed, or like Erica said, sit in jail over something that's ticky-tack, you want to be able to hold elected officials accountable. And trust you me, elected officials like being elected officials. That's why they run. And so if they have any inclination to think that they will lose their authority or their positions, they are going to listen to you. And so it is so critically important that not just in the run up to the midterm and quadrennial elections that we do it, we have to continuously talk about what's going on in our locales so that we can continue to be alert and pay attention to what's happening so that we can make the moves necessary to make those elected officials be accountable. And one of those things that I want to see happening soon, and I'm going to be talking about this more, Ellis and Quentin and Erica, is that, you know, down here in Florida, FAMU Rattler, newly minted State Senator Chevron Jones out of down there in Miami, he was a state representative, and he's going to be in the Senate in the next session. He has actually introduced a bill that would actually end qualified immunity here in the state of Florida. Now, we all know that's going to be a tough road to hoe. We get it. Florida's a primarily Republican state, but the fact that he filed it and that he's ready to fight for that, those are the types of things that we need to be lobbying right now. Because again, any other profession under the earth, if you screw up, you've got liability insurance, because people are going to be able to tap you and say, hey, this is what's up. I need some repercussions for what it is that you did. With law enforcement officers, for more often than not, with qualified immunity, you know, there are a lot of officers who are, you know, they're worried about the internal affairs investigations or what have you. But more often than not, they recognize that if they get into a shooting situation or an excessive use of force situation, they are going to be somewhat shielded from levels of liability in terms of having to pay. And I think that to a great extent, and again, I get it, our officers who are out there doing the serious stuff, the serious narcotics, the murders, the homicides, I get that, and God bless you. But I want that officer who pulls one of us to think twice about whether they want to, well, I don't have any hair anymore, but snatch me by the dome and pull me out, recognizing that, hey, even though I could fight back, I'm not going to fight back. I'm going to sue you. And those are the things that I think would have far more teeth than just even rhetoric.
Yeah, Quentin, so what would be the best way for, if you get pulled over, what's your best way? What's the best tips that somebody could get in that scenario? Officer pulls behind them, comes behind them, lights go on. What should a black person should be doing, even in the anxiety scenario? We all get it. I think even white people get that anxiety when you get pulled over by the police. They get somewhat, maybe not to our level, but I think there is some anxiety level when you get pulled over by the police. What should the steps be for that person in order to be able to make it home, as we've been saying all night?
I say stick your hands out the window where they can see them.
Okay.
Just put them out here,
Yeah,
and keep them out there. Because whatever is showing will show where your hands are the entire time. And when the officer gets to the car, let them further instruct you, but keep your hands outside the window. Let your window down here.
Okay.
Here we are. My hands are out here where you can see. Like, there's nothing about to happen until you instruct me further.
yeah.
Also, for my safety, I'm going to stick my hands outside of the window. until you instruct me further.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
I used to have this routine that when I was getting pulled over, I would call my wife and put her on speakerphone.
Mm-hmm.
This is before camera phones became so popular and right now, but I would put her on speakerphone and I would just tell her, hey, look, I'm about to get pulled over. I just want you to hear what's going on. And she would listen to the interaction. And then when we got done, I would say, hey, look, I'm good. I'm heading home. And she'd be like, okay, good. But she would have that same anxiety. So Erica, in terms of that shared anxiety that we're talking about, in terms of in the community, when we see George Floyd and Sandra Bland and Philando Castile and Michael Brown and Trayvon Martin, and we can go down and down and down the list. I know I'm missing Ahmaud Arbery. We've seen these videos. That becomes part of the collective unconscious of all African Americans. And so when we have those experiences, that anxiety gets shared, even though it's not our personal experience. We're not the ones getting pulled over. We're not the one experiencing that, but we're experiencing in our mind, and our bodies are having a visceral reaction to that. How do we find a way to overcome that, even as a community, even when we see those images on television? I know I'm asking you tough questions. Erica's going, I'm going to get a text message.
Erica's going to be like, call my office.
Respond to my next
Like,
question.
you need to pay me like it's a snake. Well, I think there are two questions within there. One is how to overcome it in the moment. And I'm like, I'm going to try that. I had never thought of sticking hands up. Because the other thing is you realize people have, now they call it the talk, but the talk sometimes people had with girls is different than the talk they had with boys.
Yeah, you're right.
I mean, it's good to have all the information. And I guess a lot of us grew up at a time where I don't remember my parents having the talk with me.
Yeah, with me.
But I was a girl.
I had mine.
Yeah.
When
I
had to talk.
I feel like it.
And mine was very simple. If you do anything that gets you in jail, we may not be able to get you out.
Sometimes when I hear these discussions, I really do think that there must have been some type of cookie cutter or manual that was handed out to our parents' generation, man, because I swear when y'all say that, it's the same conversation that we had too. Like one of the last comments Dad made to me before they got back on 75 when they dropped me off in Morehouse in August of 90 was now, he was like, son, if you're out there defending yourself, verbatim, if you're defending yourself or if you're defending some young lady and you get arrested for that, that's one thing. But if you get arrested because you're up here acting like you don't have the good sense of how you were raised by your mother and me, don't call. I'm not getting any lawyer. I'm not posting any bond. You will be on your own. And I'm sitting there like, well, thanks, Pop. But again, that was always in the back of my head when there was an opportunity to do some real dumb stuff. And again, all students, all kids have those opportunities. But there was always something in the back of my head that was like, well, I ain't trying to get arrested about that because I don't have anybody that's going to come get me.
Yeah. But the thing I would say is, in addition to putting your, as I said, I like to put your hands out the window. I don't know why I keep acting like I got to do this.
That's where they got to go.
That's an excellent opportunity to take a few really deep breaths to calm yourself down. And a lot of times, if you can start calming yourself down, you'll calm down those pathways that are causing you to sweat and those other things that are going to give off all those signals. Signals that, naturally we were talking about earlier. Quentin, Ellis, and Chuck brought up the issue that your anxiety or your nervousness may be misread or misperceived. So part of it is slowing down. So, and also when you take some deep breaths, then you can think clearer because nobody makes great decisions in a panic.
No.
So you want to have the highest level of clarity in a potentially dangerous situation. As far as how to deal with all of this global stress outside of the moment is, one of it is, it's always great to have a tribe or crew that you can talk to about what you're dealing with or how you're feeling. The other thing is, if things feel overwhelming, because there are times it just is, and sometimes either adulting or being Black and adulting just gets tough. Is that we feel like things are overwhelming. There's nothing wrong with seeing one of us for a mental health checkup. And I like to tell people to do it. You can come in and see me If you are good and you don't need me, I will happily tell you, you good. You don't need nothing.
Yeah.
So it's worth getting checked out, because the one thing that I think is the huge travesty for a lot of this country, but especially Black and brown people, is that we suffer needlessly because we feel uncomfortable with getting help.
Mm-hmm.
And then you've been suffering and struggling when you could have actually felt decent. So then you've lost time. And I know Chuck knows that I have only a minute, 60 seconds in it. But time, you can't get time back.
Right.
And you can't get periods of your life back. So I just don't want people to struggle needlessly, feeling like they have to figure out every single solution. There are reasons all of us get all of this crazy, expensive, time-sucking education.
Yeah.
It's so we can help you. So my expectation isn't that you out there know everything that I know. So quit trying to fix it all yourself.
Right.
Yeah.
So what do you say, Quentin, what do you say to those people that says that feels weird? That feels like I'm letting down my manhood by sticking my hands outside of the window and waiting for another grown man to tell me that I can move. Now, I'm saying that with the caveat that that's exactly what I did the last time I was pulled over. I rolled down my window, I stuck my hands out of the window and waited for the officer. And it was a Black officer. And I had the same visceral response, heart rate, palpitations, the whole nine. I stuck my hands out the window and waited and then when he said, "Could I see your license?" I said, "It's in my back pocket. Do I have permission to reach for it?" And he said, "Yeah." Mm-hmm. So I think in that sense, that was a de-escalation piece because he realized at that point that I wasn't going to do anything or make any movement without his agreement, right? And so therefore his approval. So therefore he can't say I did something outside the context that made him think that there was something other than just a traffic stop. And I reached and I leaned and I did the whole demonstrative movements and moved slowly. So we didn't have any problems. And he let me go, told me to slow down, and he let me go without the ticket. And so I was thankful for that, but it was just that moment. But the original question is, what do you say to that person that says that's demeaning to have to do all of that when I've just been speeding, or I just made an illegal turn, or I made a lane change, or I ran a red light, or whatever? Why do I have to do all of this demeaning behavior because this officer has some bias?
Because what's even more demeaning is to go from a family of 4 to a family of 3 by a chance encounter with someone.
Yeah.
What's even more demeaning is there being you not here without an explanation of why that's sufficient for the people who love you. Like the whole goal is, as Chuck said, we going home. The officer, when you stuck your hands out the window, Ellis was like, you know what? This guy wants to go home and he wants me to go home.
Yeah.
So this situation is immediately de-escalated.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. You weren't throwing anything out the window. You weren't throwing anything in the back of your car trying to hide something. You immediately put your hands outside the window. Meaning I am doing nothing in this car, officer.
Right.
I'm doing nothing in this car that I have an issue with you walking up on and beginning to ask me questions.
Mm-hmm.
I want to go home and I want you to go home. So that's what I'm signaling to you. And we can get past all that other stuff, but we want to go home in the evening.
So Chuck, you mentioned earlier you have a weapon. Yeah. Many African Americans, really since 2016, I won't say what happened in 2016, but since 2016, many more African Americans have been acquiring weapons, especially as the rhetoric has increased and intensified here recently. Many more African Americans have been getting weapons. Also, many African Americans have been getting concealed carry license, and understanding that many of the people on the right and the far right that have some racist tendencies, for lack of a better term, are big champions of the Second Amendment, but that seems to be suspended when the person that's exercising their Second Amendment right are Black or brown. And so how do you reconcile being a legal, law-abiding gun owner and knowing that the system is not designed for really you to be owning a gun?
Yeah, man, that is a powerful question. And, it's interesting. I saw that one of our brothers, Jay Nice, had a comment in the comments about what should we do, and he already hit it on the head. If you are a concealed carry permit holder, when you're pulled over, remember how I said earlier I slipped the bar card along with the license to the officer? Just tell the officer when you're slipping them the license, sir, I am a concealed permit holder. My weapon is locked in the glove compartment or it's under the passenger seat, just so they will know, hopefully if they have on the lapel cam and what have you, that will pick that up. But usually, I would say usually, hinting usually again, more often than not, they will appreciate that, just like with the gesture that you did with your hands out and the fact that you're talking calmly and letting them know and letting them see that you're a law-abiding citizen. Now, of course, brother, what happened to Brother Philando Castile is still unconscionable. It's still problematic. I still struggle. And when I say struggle is just a nice way of saying I'm still very angry with the idea that the NRA and other gun enthusiast organizations didn't rally behind that law-abiding, gun-carrying young black male. But again, we know the deal and we know the drill, and we just have to go ahead and keep moving. I do think that for those so inclined, some people are afraid of weapons, and that's okay. But I do think it's important to carry. I think it's important to train yourself. One of the things that I enjoy a lot here in Tallahassee, I have some friends who they provide coursework. They are either former military or former law enforcement or current law enforcement who their side hustle is training folks on weapon safety and how to protect yourself. They sometimes will even come into your home, show you how to defend your home if you have to do that. Survival tactics, it depends on what's in it for you, but you can get a course anywhere across the country developed in mind for you to have that peace of mind. But I would be remiss if I didn't note this, which is, Ellis, when you make the comment about the disparate treatment, so to speak, in regards to that Second Amendment, it is so very true. I mean, at the end of the day, many states across the country have some form of stand your ground law now. I tell a story often. I've written about it, but I had a murder case 4 years ago over in Live Oak, Florida. And I know both of y'all remember Live Oak. One black woman killed her white best friend in self-defense. I mean, the white woman was larger. They were arguing over a guy. They were both allegedly seeing the same guy, and turned into a brawl where my client was in a position where and it's not just her saying this, there were witnesses who were like, the young white lady was bashing her head in to the point where they were expecting to see her head open at any point in time. Mm-hmm. She was able to, in a 1 in a million stroke, grab a knife that was nearby, stuck her friend in the neck one time, just trying to get her off of her. The young lady died. This was in my client's house, okay, in her front yard, but that's considered the house. It's Quentin, part of the curtilage and what have you. We had to go all the way to the door. And by the door, I mean, we had to try that case over the course of a week. All white jury. My stand your ground motion, though well written, was denied without even a whole lot of comment. We had a full day hearing on it, denied. We picked the jury on Monday, Mr. Hobbs. We picked that jury. We tried it all week. The jury, all white, did come back with a not guilty verdict for my client. But sometimes in the back of my head, that whole week, I kept thinking to myself, what happens if they don't realize that because she's black and because this young lady's white? And when we were in that courtroom, y'all, and again, I talk about this from time to time, the courtroom was stratified along race. On the defense table on back, on our side of the courtroom, all black. Right. Prosecutor table on back, all white. They had to have deputies from 2 counties there because there was so much talk about, we're going to kill that Negro lawyer out of Tallahassee. We're going to do this and that. In fact, that whole week of trial, Ellis and Quentin and Erica, I was armed to the teeth. Went to bed every night with mine right next to me. I said, if they get me in this Holiday Inn, somebody's going to be going to glory right along with me, right? But the point being is that it hit me very plainly at that point. I was like, wow, it's beyond just the theoretical or the talking point. I'm like, there really are disparate impacts on what happens to us with these laws as opposed to them. And I'm just grateful that an all-white jury was able to still see that a woman's home is her castle and that she had a right to defend herself. But sometimes I can wake up perspiring now wondering, what if they had not? She would have been in prison for life right now just for defending herself. So we have to be careful on that as a people and recognize that it is still a crapshoot when you choose to bear arms and or defend yourself, that somebody might not see it the same way because of our color.
Quinn, what if she had lesser representation?
That happens all the time.
Right.
It's plenty. Understand this. It's plenty of innocent people in jail. Plenty.
Yeah.
Like, to the point where sometimes people get lost in jail and don't come up. Like when I was sitting on the bench, sometimes we would have to find people.
Wow.
And luckily you'd have a clerk or a deputy or whatever who would say, hey, this person hadn't been on calendars, etc., because we don't know.
Wow.
Given how many people come in and out of the jail, you don't know whether somebody is actually left or not. Like, so that happens all the time. Like, and people go to trial and they lose who are innocent. And that's why you see people getting exonerated when people now have more sophisticated crime solving techniques such as DNA and cold cases and all that stuff, where they can find stuff to exonerate people 20, 30, 40 years after the fact.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. So this has been a riveting discussion. We're like an hour, 20 minutes in, and I had to look over and see how much time, because this discussion could continue, because we understand that it's not one, and Dr. Erica said it so eloquently, it's not something that can be answered in one night and in an hour and 20 minutes. This is something that has been built up since 1619. I'm just going to let y'all look up that date if y'all don't know what that date was. It started in 1619 and has continued all the way into 2020. And so for us it's a bit arrogant to think that we can answer that, but we want to add to the growing list of discussions. We want to add to the knowledge. We want to add to what people are thinking about it. So I think, and from some of the comments that said that this was a well-rounded discussion. I don't think that we were throwing police under the bus. We were talking about real situations and real solutions. So I do think that Quentin's point, when we're talking about solutions, putting your hands out of the window, it's a small act. It's a small act to get home, to be safe. You're sending a message to that officer, you're sending a message to your family, you're sending a message to the world that I'm going to humble myself in this moment so I can be home with my family and continue to move forward. I do also agree with Chuck that there's got to be some better training. There's got to be some better training for police officers. We have to have more sensitivity, I think, and it can't just be a show. It's got to be legitimate, and it's got to be for real. It's got to be longer lasting. And there have been some really good examples of those type of things happening. We all agree defund the police it's a ridiculous assertion. It's a scare tactic used for political purposes and not a real conversation that needs to be had. Yes, there are some people that are saying that, but that is such a small percentage of African Americans that we're not saying defund the police. We're just saying, hey, look, they've got some training that needs to happen, and they need to be a little bit better about that. So I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. Dr. Erica, thank you for joining us and talking to us, answering my tough questions. I know I know you don't get it, but it's okay. Quentin, always a pleasure. I think you brought a unique perspective in terms of speaking up for law enforcement, but understanding your role as a Black man standing in the gap and being on both sides, on the legal side, as well as being a Black man in America. I think that what you spoke eloquently tonight about being able to see both sides and say, okay, look, they've got to do some things, but we've got to be better as a people with regards to some of our behaviors. And Chuck, always a pleasure to have you on. Always a pleasure to talk with you. I think your knowledge from way back to your Brain Bowl days.
Brain Bowl.
And you have brought that forward, and so I want to say kudos to your deceased dad and your mom, Vivian, for raising such a well-rounded and intellectual young man. So again, thank you all for joining us. I look forward to speaking with you all again, either individually or collectively, if Erica will come back. I think she can make me send her the questions ahead of time next time. But again, get to your families, love yourself, love your family, love your community, stay safe, please, people. I want to give my COVID disclaimer, 3 W's: wear a mask, wash your hands, watch your distance. Vaccine is coming. Make your own decisions about the vaccine. Make your own decision about the vaccine, but please make it an informed decision. Get all the facts. Tuskegee was real, yes. Henrietta Lacks was real, yes. sterilizations, forced sterilizations were real. But look at what's happening in 2020, and look, there are prominent Black doctors in serious positions working on this vaccine and have been in decision-making positions across the nation on this vaccine to make sure that it is safe and efficient for Black people. And so please, again, I'm not telling you what to do. I'm just saying, get all the information before you make a decision. With that, good night. Thank you all for joining us.
See you later.